Russia's war against Ukraine has increasingly become a war against electricity, heat, and survival itself, as Moscow intensifies its systematic campaign to destroy Ukraine's energy infrastructure, turning power plants, substations, and transmission lines into primary military targets. These attacks are not random acts of destruction but part of a calculated strategy aimed at breaking civilian morale, weakening the economy, and forcing political concessions by plunging millions of Ukrainians into darkness and cold. Since late 2022 and escalating further through 2024 and into the current phase of the war, Russia has launched repeated waves of missile and drone strikes designed specifically to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses and cripple the national power grid. Cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and Iranian-designed Shahid drones are often launched simultaneously, saturating defenses and increasing the chance that at least some weapons reach their targets. Thermal power plants, hydroelectric facilities, transformer stations, and high-voltage nodes have been hit repeatedly, sometimes repaired only to be struck again days or weeks later. The goal is not just temporary disruption but cumulative damage that becomes harder and more expensive to fix over time. Ukraine's energy workers have become unsung frontline soldiers, racing to repair destroyed infrastructure under constant threat of renewed strikes, often working without rest and sometimes losing their lives in the process. Despite their efforts, the scale of the damage has forced rolling blackouts across cities and rural areas alike, affecting hospitals, water pumping stations, public transport, and communications networks. In winter, the consequences are especially severe, as electricity shortages cascade into heating failures, leaving homes without warmth and freezing temperatures. Russia's leadership understands that cold, darkness, and uncertainty can erode public resilience just as effectively as military defeat on the battlefield. By targeting energy, Moscow seeks to make daily life unbearable, hoping civilians will pressure their government to accept unfavorable terms. These strikes also aim to strain Ukraine's finances, as emergency repairs divert resources from military needs and reconstruction projects. International partners have stepped in with generators, transformers, air defense systems, and financial aid, but the challenge remains immense. Ukraine's grid was not designed to withstand such sustained, precision attacks, and adapting it under fire is a monumental task. Russia, meanwhile, frames these attacks as retaliation for Ukrainian strikes on occupied territories or Russian soil, but the pattern reveals a broader doctrine of collective punishment. The destruction of energy infrastructure does not directly stop Ukrainian soldiers at the front, but it undermines the society that supports them. Yet despite the hardship, Ukraine has demonstrated remarkable resilience. Cities adapt to blackout schedules, businesses install backup power, and civilians organize community support networks. Each winter survived becomes a symbol of defiance rather than defeat. The energy war has thus become a psychological battlefield, where endurance itself is a form of resistance. Russia may control missiles and drones, but Ukraine counters with adaptability, solidarity, and the refusal to surrender its future to darkness. Russia's campaign against Ukraine's energy infrastructure has also reshaped the strategic priorities of both sides, turning air defense into one of the most critical elements of Ukraine's survival. Each missile intercepted is not just a military success but a hospital kept running, a city kept warm, and a family spared another night in darkness. However, the imbalance in resources remains stark. Russia can still produce or procure missiles and drones faster than Ukraine can intercept them, especially as Western stockpiles face their own limits. This creates a brutal arithmetic of attrition in which even a small percentage of successful strikes can have devastating effects. Ukrainian officials have repeatedly warned that without sustained deliveries of advanced air defense systems and interceptor missiles, the energy grid will remain vulnerable, no matter how fast repairs are carried out. The Kremlin is acutely aware of this vulnerability and times its largest strikes to coincide with politically sensitive moments, such as international summits, aid negotiations, or the onset of winter, maximizing both physical and psychological impact. Beyond immediate blackouts, the long-term damage to Ukraine's energy sector threatens economic recovery and post-war reconstruction. Factories cannot operate reliably without stable power, foreign investors hesitate, and entire regions face depopulation as residents relocate in search of basic living conditions. This slow erosion aligns with Russia's broader objective of making Ukraine appear economically unviable as an independent state. Yet the strategy has also backfired in important ways. The deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure has reinforced international support for Ukraine, hardening perceptions of Russia as a state willing to weaponize suffering. Each blackout becomes another argument for sanctions, another justification for military aid, and another reminder of what is at stake beyond territorial lines on a map. Ukraine, meanwhile, is accelerating efforts to decentralize its energy system, investing in smaller, more flexible power sources that are harder to destroy in a single strike. Mobile power units, underground substations, and dispersed generation represent lessons learned under fire, transforming vulnerability into adaptation. The energy war has thus become a test of endurance on both sides. Russia bets that Ukraine and its allies will tire first, that political will in Europe and North America will weaken as costs rise and attention shifts elsewhere. Ukraine bets that resilience, innovation, and sustained international backing will outlast Russia's capacity to inflict damage. Every repaired transformer, every restored power line, and every winter endured is a quiet rejection of the idea that missiles can decide a nation's fate. The battle for Ukraine's power grid is not only about electricity, but about whether modern warfare can still force submission through civilian suffering, or whether societies can adapt faster than they can be broken. As the conflict drags on, the energy war increasingly defines how ordinary Ukrainians experience the invasion on a daily basis, blurring the line between front lines and home fronts. Unlike artillery fire heard in distant regions, the loss of electricity is felt instantly and everywhere, turning apartments into cold shells, plunging cities into silence broken only by generators, and forcing families to reorganize their lives around uncertainty. Schools switch to remote learning or suspend classes entirely, hospitals ration power to critical wards, and elderly residents face heightened risks as elevators stop working and medical equipment fails. Russia's strategy relies on this accumulation of small, relentless hardships, believing that exhaustion will eventually succeed where shock and awe did not. The repetition is deliberate, with each new wave of attacks designed to remind Ukrainians that recovery is fragile and temporary. Yet this cycle has also normalized resilience. Ukrainians have adapted blackout schedules into daily routines, charging devices when power returns, cooking in advance, and transforming basements into heated shelters. What was once a crisis has become a grimly efficient system of survival, undermining Russia's expectation of collapse. On a geopolitical level, the energy war has altered Europe's own calculations. Countries that once depended heavily on Russian gas now see Ukraine's struggle as a warning of what energy dependence can enable. This has accelerated diversification efforts, reshaped energy markets, and tied Ukraine's survival more closely to broader European security. Every missile that strikes a power plant echoes beyond Ukraine's borders, reinforcing the understanding that infrastructure is now a primary target in modern warfare. The conflict has become a case study in how technological societies can be attacked not just through armies but through networks that sustain daily life. For Ukraine, the defense of the power grid is inseparable from the defense of sovereignty. Keeping the lights on is an act of resistance, a statement that the state still functions and the future still exists. For Russia, the failure to plunge Ukraine into lasting darkness represents a strategic frustration, revealing the limits of coercion through destruction. As months turn into years, the energy war stands as one of the clearest illustrations of how this conflict is not only about territory, but about endurance, adaptation, and the will of a society to remain intact under constant pressure. Whether Ukraine's grid ultimately survives intact or emerges transformed, the attempt to destroy it will be remembered as a defining chapter of the war, one that tested the resilience of civilians as much as the strength of armies. The long-term implications of Russia's campaign against Ukraine's energy infrastructure extend far beyond the immediate hardships of blackouts and cold homes, shaping how the war will be remembered and how future conflicts may be fought. By deliberately targeting systems that sustain civilian life, Russia has pushed the boundaries of what modern warfare looks like, testing whether societies can be coerced into submission through sustained disruption rather than decisive battlefield victories. For Ukraine, this has forced a painful but transformative evolution. Energy security is no longer treated as a technical or economic issue but as a core element of national defense. Engineers, planners, and military officials now work in coordination, redesigning networks with redundancy, concealment, and rapid repair in mind. This wartime adaptation may ultimately leave Ukraine with a more resilient and decentralized energy system than it had before the invasion, forged through necessity and experience. At the same time, the human cost of this campaign continues to accumulate quietly. Every blackout compounds stress, every winter attack deepens trauma, and every night spent without light reinforces the sense that the war is inescapable. Children grow up associating darkness with danger, while adults carry the constant anxiety of not knowing when the next strike will come. Russia's leadership may calculate these effects as acceptable collateral in pursuit of strategic goals, but they also ensure that reconciliation becomes ever more distant. A population subjected to years of deliberate civilian suffering does not forget easily, and the memory of frozen apartments and powerless hospitals will shape Ukraine's national consciousness for generations. Internationally, the energy war has strengthened arguments for redefining war crimes in the age of infrastructure targeting, as legal scholars and human rights organizations debate where the line lies between military necessity and collective punishment. Ukraine's experience is increasingly cited in global discussions about protecting civilian systems in future conflicts, from power grids to water supplies and digital networks. In this sense, Ukraine has become both a battlefield and a warning. Russia's inability to achieve decisive results despite relentless strikes exposes a central paradox of modern warfare. Destroying infrastructure can inflict immense suffering, yet it does not guarantee political victory. Instead, it may harden resistance, unify allies, and isolate the aggressor. As the war continues, the struggle over Ukraine's energy grid remains unresolved, suspended between destruction and repair, darkness and light. What is already clear, however, is that this front of the war has revealed the true stakes of the conflict, not just who controls land, but whether a society under attack can preserve its dignity, functionality, and hope in the face of sustained attempts to break it. As Ukraine continues to endure this sustained assault on its energy system, the contrast between intention and outcome grows sharper with each passing month. Russia intended to paralyze a nation, yet instead it has forced Ukraine to become one of the most battle-hardened societies in terms of civilian resilience in modern history. Municipalities now plan for missile strikes the way other cities plan for storms, with backup generators pre-positioned, emergency protocols rehearsed, and public communication systems designed to function even during extended outages. Civil defense has expanded beyond shelters and sirens to include energy literacy, teaching citizens how to conserve power, manage heating safely, and support vulnerable neighbors during prolonged blackouts. This collective adaptation has transformed energy survival into a shared civic responsibility, reinforcing social cohesion rather than dissolving it. From a military perspective, the failure to break Ukraine through infrastructure attacks highlights a critical limitation of coercive strategies in wars against determined populations. The assumption that civilian suffering automatically translates into political pressure has proven flawed when national identity, perceived existential threat, and external support align. Instead of demanding capitulation, blackouts have often strengthened Ukrainian resolve, reinforcing the belief that survival itself is a form of victory. Russia's energy campaign has also exposed its own strategic constraints. High-precision missiles are expensive, production capacity is finite, and reliance on foreign components has complicated resupply under sanctions. Each strike on a transformer represents not just damage inflicted, but resources expended that cannot be easily replaced. Meanwhile, Ukraine's repairs, though costly, often rely on ingenuity, cannibalized parts, and international assistance that collectively offset Russian advantages. This asymmetry undermines the long-term sustainability of Russia's approach. As the war moves forward, the energy front remains dynamic rather than decisive, marked by cycles of destruction and recovery that neither side can fully resolve. Yet in this unresolved struggle lies a powerful narrative. Ukraine's ability to function under deliberate deprivation challenges the idea that modern states are inherently fragile. It suggests that resilience, when combined with adaptability and solidarity, can neutralize even the most brutal strategies. The energy war may not determine the immediate outcome of the conflict, but it will shape how victory and defeat are understood. If Ukraine emerges intact, it will not be because its infrastructure was spared, but because its society learned to survive without certainty, light, or comfort, refusing to let darkness define its future. Looking ahead, the battle over Ukraine's energy infrastructure is increasingly shaping post-war thinking even as the war itself remains unresolved. Ukrainian planners no longer ask whether the grid can return to its pre-war state, but whether it ever should. The experience of sustained attacks has revealed structural weaknesses that once seemed theoretical, pushing the country toward a future built on decentralization, redundancy, and integration with European energy networks. Small-scale generation, renewable sources, and cross-border power connections are no longer just environmental or economic ambitions, but strategic necessities born from survival. In this sense, Russia's campaign has unintentionally accelerated Ukraine's transformation away from the very dependencies Moscow once exploited. At the same time, the emotional legacy of the energy war continues to deepen. Blackouts have become markers of memory, with entire communities recalling specific nights of darkness, cold, and fear as defining moments of their lives. These shared experiences bind people together, creating a collective narrative of endurance that will shape Ukrainian identity long after the last missile falls. For many, the hum of a generator or the sudden return of light carries symbolic weight, representing not comfort but continuity, proof that the state and society still function despite constant threat. Russia's leadership may view infrastructure as a lever of control, but the Ukrainian experience suggests that when survival is framed as resistance, deprivation loses much of its coercive power. Instead of breaking morale, prolonged hardship can clarify what is at stake, stripping the conflict down to fundamental questions of existence and self-determination. International observers increasingly recognize this dimension of the war, seeing Ukraine not only as a victim of aggression but as a test case for how modern societies respond when the systems they depend on are deliberately dismantled. The outcome of this test will resonate far beyond Eastern Europe, influencing military doctrines, civil defense planning, and legal norms around the protection of civilian infrastructure. As long as the war continues, Ukraine's power grid will remain a contested space, repaired and destroyed, illuminated and darkened in cycles that reflect the broader rhythm of the conflict. Yet regardless of how many times the lights go out, the underlying lesson endures: infrastructure can be damaged, comfort can be taken away, but a society prepared to adapt can deny an aggressor the ultimate victory of submission. In that sense, the energy war has revealed not just vulnerability, but an unexpected strength at the heart of Ukraine's resistance.